This jet terrified the West, the MiG-25 Foxbat. The USSR's strategic air defense was the responsibility of the Soviet air defense forces during the Cold War. This required managing border infractions that were unintentional, as well as, more significantly, guarding the enormous USSR airspace against U.S. observation aircraft and strategic bombers carrying freefall nuclear weapons. These types of aircraft's performance progressively increased. The Lockheed U-2's very high-altitude overflights of Soviet territory in the late 1950s made it clear that a higher altitude interceptor aircraft was needed than what was at that time readily available. The Mach 2 Corvair B-58 Hustler followed the subsonic Boeing B-47 Stratojet and Boeing B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers, with the Mach 3 North American B-70 Valkyrie then under development. The PVO defense system needed a significant upgrade. Thus, at the beginning of 1958, manned interceptors with a top speed of 3,000 kilometers per hour and a height up to 27 kilometers were requested. Sukhoi and Mikoyan responded. Throughout the latter half of the 1950s, the Mikoyan-Gurevich OKB developed several interceptors, including the I-1, I-3U, I-7U, I-75, YE-150, YE-150A, YE-152, YE-152A, YE-152P, and YE-152M. The Tumansky R-15 engine, of which the YE-150 was built expressly to test, would eventually be used in two MiG-25 engines. The YE-152, also known as YE-166, was the result, and it broke multiple world records. The YE-152M was intended to be the definitive heavy interceptor design. It was built from one of two YE-152 aircraft. But before it was done, the Tupolev Tu-128 had been chosen by the PVO. The single-engine YE-152M was scrapped when the MiG-25 project was well underway. The Design Bureau looked at several potential designs for the new aircraft. One had the engines placed next to one another, similar to the MiG-19. The second aircraft featured a stepped configuration with one engine amidships, with exhaust under the fuselage, and another in the rear fuselage. The third proposal had two engines stacked vertically, comparable to the English Electric Lightning's engine configuration. Both options 2 and 3 were rejected because they would produce extremely tall aircraft that would be difficult to maintain because of the size of the engines. The dangers of any thrust asymmetry during flight led to the rejection of the notions of mounting the engines in underwing nacelles. After choosing an engine arrangement, it was considered adding variable sweep wings and a navigator as a second crew member. Variable geometry would enhance subsonic mobility at the expense of a smaller fuel tank. The proposal was quickly abandoned since the reconnaissance aircraft would fly at a high speed and height. The Mikoyan-Gurevich OKB had a tough time deciding which materials to employ for the aircraft because of the thermal strains experienced in flight above Mach 2. High-strength stainless steel was required for the wings and fuselage, and E2 heat-resistant plexiglass had to be used for the canopy. It would have been wonderful to use titanium instead of steel, but it was pricey and challenging to work with. The use of heavier nickel steel was necessary since the issue of cracks in welded titanium structures with thin walls could not be resolved. It was significantly less expensive than titanium and enabled welding as well as heat-resistant sealing. 80% nickel-steel alloy, 11% aluminum, and 9% titanium were used to build the MiG-25. Combining spot welding, automatic machine welding, and hand arc welding techniques, steel components were created. Equipped. The massive 600 kilowatt radar of the MiG-25 was designed to detect high-flying aircraft up to 100 kilometers distant and burn right through their jamming equipment to locate enemy bombers. And it would just require 4 of the largest air-to-air missiles ever made as the only type of weapon. A dedicated reconnaissance variant with sophisticated surveillance cameras, a longer range, and a higher service ceiling would be available in addition to the interceptor. Most MiG-25s would be constructed as specialized interceptors, while certain versions might even be fitted with high-altitude bombing capabilities. In 1969, mass manufacturing of the MiG-25 commenced, and at its peak, 100 of them were being produced per month. The Cold War would be significantly impacted by the MiG-25, but not in the way the Soviets had anticipated. It would fly higher and faster than any combat jet in history. The Soviet Union made sure the Americans were there for their enormous air display in 1967. Even for Western audiences, the event was aired in English. The Soviet Union showcased several brand new aircraft, but they kept the greatest for last. 3 prototype MiG-25s were shot flying past the audience in the final 10 minutes. It was the first time the new aircraft will be seen by anyone outside of the Soviet Union, and it raised red flags in the minds of Western intelligence. The blurry video showed an aircraft with all the characteristics of a quick fighter. Extreme mobility was implied by the wing's exceptionally massive size. Huge air intakes suggested large engines, and scientists surmised that advanced lightweight titanium was used. However, the fact that the plane remarkably resembled plans for America's next-generation air dominance fighter, a jet that wouldn't be ready for another 10 years, alarmed them the most. Only a few months later, the Soviet Union began recording astonishing new records for speed and altitude, and the media soon learned of them, leaving military planners in Washington baffled as to how the Soviets had advanced so far, spreading worries that the enigmatic new plane would perform better than anything created in the West. For the first time, the Soviet Union had a jet that the U.S. Air Force Chief of Staff openly acknowledged the U.S. could not match. The U.S. was driven to dramatically raise the performance goals for its next-generation fighters because of the perceived threat. However, the Americans had been clamoring for any intelligence they could get for years. When Israeli radar controllers started monitoring MiG-25s over the Sinai Peninsula in 1971, they got another peek. The jets were observed flying at a height of more than 20 kilometers and more than 2.5 times the speed of sound. The jets flew so high and quickly that no fighter in the entire world could catch them. At one point, they even tracked one of the MiGs accelerating beyond Mach 3. The MiG-25 was an enigma that worried Western intelligence for more than a decade, but that was about to alter dramatically. On September 6, 1976, the Soviet Union's most clandestine airplane showed up seemingly out of nowhere over northern Japan. Then, after nearly colliding with an airliner and drifting off the end of a runway, it made a stunning crash landing at a quiet commercial airport. It was the first time a MiG-25 had ever been seen in the West. No one appeared to know how or from where it had come as curious bystanders gathered. Lieutenant Victor Belenko, who was 29 years old, was operating the MiG. He was quickly apprehended and told authorities that he had fled the Soviet Union because of the oppressive conditions at his airbase and his dissatisfaction with life there. He went on to ask for asylum in the United States.